Ethan Collins had always believed he was untouchable. As the only heir to the vast Collins empire, his life was a constant procession of carefully curated luxury. Every decision, every move he made was meticulously calculated, leaving no room for failure. He was the epitome of control, sharp, powerful, and utterly convinced of his superiority. His father, Richard Collins, had instilled in him a sense of entitlement so deep it was practically embedded in his DNA. To Ethan, there was no challenge he couldn't conquer, no obstacle he couldn't remove with money or influence. But everything changed the day Richard Collins died. The funeral was a cold, somber affair, much like the relationship Ethan had with his father. They hadn't been close, not really. Richard had been more of a mentor, a coach who pushed him toward perfection with an iron hand, rather than a father who nurtured or guided. And Ethan had risen to every challenge, every test. He was the Collins heir for a reason, ruthless, ambitious, and unwavering. Yet, as he stood there, watching his father's coffin being lowered into the ground, he felt something gnawing at him, a sensation unfamiliar and unsettling. Uncertainty. The day after the funeral, Ethan was summoned to the Grand Collins estate, a sprawling mansion that overlooked the city from a secluded hilltop. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of leather and polished wood, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of his family's legacy. The large windows offered a panoramic view of the skyline, but Ethan's eyes were fixed on the document in front of him, the will. Seated in the imposing office that had once belonged to his father, Ethan leaned back in the black leather chair, its cold surface creaking beneath him. His lawyer, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a carefully neutral expression, began to read Richard Collins' final testament. The terms were clear. Ethan would inherit the family's business, the estate, and all associated wealth, but with a catch. To my son, Ethan, I leave my entire estate, including Collins Enterprises, with one condition. He must marry Emily Carter within 6 months of my passing. Should he fail to meet this requirement, the company will be sold off and the proceeds donated to charity. Ethan's heart froze. Emily Carter. The name stirred a distant memory, but it was fuzzy, indistinct, like trying to recall a dream long forgotten. He knew her, or rather, he had known her once. She was the daughter of Henry Carter, a man who had once been his father's closest friend and business partner. But that had been years ago, before the Carters had fallen from grace. Henry had lost everything in a string of bad investments, and his family had all but disappeared from the social circles Ethan inhabited. Ethan's initial shock quickly gave way to anger. Marry her? He clenched his jaw, feeling the blood rush to his face. This was absurd. Why in the world would his father force him into such a humiliating situation? He had spent his life building an empire of his own, mastering the art of negotiation, manipulation, and control. And now, at the pinnacle of his career, he was being told that his entire future hinged on a marriage he had no interest in. The room felt stifling, the weight of his father's demand pressing down on him like a vice. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sharp sound that echoed in the silence. The lawyer watched him carefully, but Ethan didn't care. He walked to the large window behind the desk, staring out at the city below. His city. Why? He muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of his father's motives. The old man had always been calculating, always 2 steps ahead of everyone else. But this felt like a cruel joke, some twisted test designed to strip Ethan of the control he had spent his entire life cultivating. What kind of game was Richard playing from beyond the grave? Emily Carter. The thought of her made his skin prickle with irritation. She was nothing more than a faded memory, a relic from a past that had long since been buried. What little he remembered of her wasn't impressive. She had always been quiet, shy even, overshadowed by her father's business acumen and her family's wealth. That was before everything crumbled for them. What could she possibly offer him now after all these years? From what he had heard, she was practically destitute, living in obscurity with her family's fortune long gone. A bitter smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Was this his father's way of reminding him that wealth could be fleeting, that power wasn't absolute? If so, the message was clear, but Ethan wasn't about to let it dictate his life. No, he would play along for now. He had no intention of letting a woman like Emily Carter derail his future. He would marry her, fulfill the terms of the will, and once the company was securely his, he would find a way to dissolve the marriage. It was business, pure and simple. "Fine," Ethan said, turning back toward the lawyer. His voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp, cold. "I'll do it. Set up the meeting." The lawyer nodded, his expression unchanged, but Ethan could see the faintest flicker of curiosity behind his professional mask. No doubt, he was wondering how Ethan would handle this unexpected challenge. Everyone would be watching, waiting to see if the golden boy of the Collins dynasty would falter under the weight of his father's final command. But Ethan didn't falter. He never did. As the lawyer gathered the documents and left the room, Ethan remained standing by the window, his gaze distant, but his mind racing. Emily Carter. In a few short weeks, she would become his wife by contract, not by choice. He had no interest in her, no respect for her, and certainly no intention of ever letting her get in the way of his plans. But as he stared out at the city that sprawled below him, a question lingered at the edge of his thoughts, uninvited and unwelcome. What if this marriage wasn't as simple as he thought? What if Emily Carter wasn't the naive, broken woman he remembered? The idea irritated him, but it also intrigued him just enough to keep him on edge. For the first time in years, Ethan Collins didn't feel entirely in control, and that made him angry and curious. How would he manage a marriage that seemed destined to challenge everything he believed? Could he truly keep his iron grip on his future? Or was this the beginning of a game he didn't know how to win? How will Ethan handle a marriage that defies all his beliefs about power, control, and wealth? Ethan Collins had never been nervous in his life, at least not in any way that he would ever admit. But today, standing at the grand entrance of the Collins estate, waiting for Emily Carter to arrive, he felt a tightening in his chest that he couldn't quite shake. The towering oak doors, ornate and imposing, loomed before him like a threshold he wasn't sure he wanted to cross. It wasn't fear exactly that stirred in his gut. No, Ethan didn't do fear. It was more a sense of anticipation, mixed with irritation, that gnawed at him. He had agreed to this marriage out of necessity, not desire. His father's ridiculous condition had forced his hand, and now he was about to meet his future wife. He still couldn't believe it. Wife. The word tasted bitter on his tongue, like something alien and unwelcome in his carefully structured world. Yet here he was, waiting for a woman he barely remembered, a woman he had no intention of loving, respecting, or even caring about. This was business, a transaction, nothing more. As the black town car rolled up the driveway, Ethan straightened his posture. His suit was immaculate, every inch of him radiating the calm, controlled image he had perfected over the years. But behind that cool facade, his mind was racing. What was she like now? The last time he'd seen Emily Carter, she was little more than a shadow, a quiet, unassuming girl at social events. Her father, Henry Carter, had been a loud, boisterous man, full of charm and promise. But after his downfall, Emily had vanished from the Collins world, becoming a footnote in Ethan's life, until now. The car stopped, and for a long moment nothing happened. Then, the door opened, and Emily stepped out. Ethan felt his breath catch, but he quickly composed himself, his expression unreadable. Emily Carter was not the timid girl he remembered. She stood tall, her back straight, with a quiet confidence that took him by surprise. She wore a simple but elegant black dress, her dark hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. Her face was calm, almost serene, but her eyes, those sharp green eyes, held a spark of something that immediately unsettled him. Determination, defiance, whatever it was enough to make Ethan feel like the ground had shifted beneath him, just a little. He didn't like it. "Emily," he said smoothly, stepping forward, his hand outstretched in a gesture that was more for show than warmth. "It's been a long time." She looked at his hand for a brief second before taking it, her grip firm but brief. "Yes, it has," she replied, her voice steady, almost too calm. She didn't smile, didn't offer any pleasantries. There was a sharpness to her tone, a quiet force that made Ethan's jaw tighten. He had expected her to be nervous, maybe even grateful for this arrangement that would no doubt pull her out of the financial mess her family had fallen into. But as she stood before him, there was no trace of insecurity. She wasn't the broken, desperate woman he had imagined. Instead, she seemed completely in control, as if this marriage was a choice she had made, not a sentence she had been handed. For the first time, Ethan felt the familiar sensation of control slipping through his fingers. "Well," he said, his smile tight, "shall we?" He gestured toward the house, and she nodded once before following him inside. As they entered the vast foyer, the tension between them thickened like a heavy fog. Ethan walked ahead, leading her through the halls of the estate, each room more grandiose than the last. He could feel her eyes on him, studying him, as if she were appraising more than just the mansion. She was trying to read him, and that unsettled him even more. "So," he said, breaking the silence, "I imagine this isn't how you thought your life would turn out." Emily didn't miss a beat. "No, but life has a funny way of surprising you, doesn't it?" There was something in her voice, something that made Ethan's skin prickle with unease. She wasn't here to play the part of the meek, grateful bride. She had her own agenda, and for the first time Ethan realized he might not be the one holding all the cards. The wedding was a cold affair, devoid of warmth or celebration. The Collins Estate's grand ballroom had been transformed into an elegant venue, complete with white roses, crystal chandeliers, and rows of society's finest. But beneath the lavish surface, there was an undeniable chill in the air. This wasn't a union built on love or even mutual respect. It was a business deal, plain and simple. Ethan stood at the altar, his posture rigid, his face an unreadable mask. Next to him, Emily looked calm, almost detached, as if the spectacle around her meant nothing. Her gaze was steady, her expression serene. To the outside world, they looked like the perfect couple, beautiful, powerful, and poised. But inside, a war was brewing. When the officiant asked them to exchange vows, Ethan spoke with calculated precision. His words were measured, cold, as if he were signing a contract rather than pledging his life to someone. Emily, to her credit, mirrored his tone, her voice calm and steady. There was no emotion behind her words, no hint of vulnerability. If she was affected by this charade, she didn't show it. As they said their I do's, Ethan could feel the weight of his father's final demand pressing down on him. This marriage wasn't about love. It wasn't even about legacy anymore. It was about control, control that he was desperately trying to maintain, but was slowly slipping through his grasp. When it came time for the kiss, Ethan leaned in, his lips barely brushing hers. It was mechanical, cold. Emily didn't flinch, didn't pull away. But when their eyes met, there was a flicker of something dark and unspoken. Ethan couldn't place it, but it sent a chill down his spine. In the days that followed, Ethan found himself growing increasingly frustrated with Emily. She was everything he hadn't expected her to be. Instead of being grateful for the opportunity to marry into wealth and regain some semblance of the life her family had lost, she was calm, collected, and maddeningly indifferent to the power he wielded. It infuriated him. No matter what he did, Emily remained unaffected by his attempts to control the situation. When he flaunted his wealth, she barely blinked. When he tried to belittle her, she met his gaze with a quiet strength that left him feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't felt in years. He had spent his entire life mastering the art of manipulation, bending people to his will with charm, money, and power. But Emily, she was different. She didn't play by his rules. One evening, a week after their wedding, Ethan decided to confront her. They were sitting in the lavish dining room of the estate, the table set with the finest china, candles casting a warm glow across the room. But the atmosphere was anything but romantic. They ate in silence, the only sound the clinking of silverware against porcelain. Finally, Ethan couldn't take it anymore. "You're awfully quiet," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. He set down his fork, leaning back in his chair as he studied her. I would have thought you'd have more to say now that you've secured your position here. Emily didn't look up from her plate. What would you like me to say, Ethan? Her tone was so calm, so maddeningly controlled, that it took every ounce of restraint for Ethan not to slam his fist on the table. I don't know, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Maybe some gratitude? After all, this marriage has done wonders for you, hasn't it? You've gone from poverty to living in a mansion, married to one of the most powerful men in the city. I'd say you've come out on top. Finally, Emily looked up, her green eyes locking onto his. There was no anger in her gaze, no trace of the wounded woman he had expected. Instead, there was something else, something that made Ethan's stomach twist. Do you really think that's why I'm here? She asked, her voice quiet, but steady. For the money? The power? Ethan smirked, leaning forward. Isn't it? Emily held his gaze for a long moment before setting down her fork. She folded her hands neatly in her lap, her posture calm, almost regal. You don't know anything about me, Ethan, she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. You never have. The words stung more than Ethan would have liked to admit. He had always prided himself on being able to read people, to predict their motives and manipulate them to his advantage. But Emily, she was a puzzle he couldn't solve, and that terrified him. The weeks passed, and the tension between them only grew. Ethan, used to being in control, found himself increasingly frustrated by Emily's refusal to bend to his will. No matter what he did, she remained calm, composed, and maddeningly indifferent to his attempts to assert dominance. Their conversations became a battlefield of words, each one laced with subtext and unspoken truths. Ethan would throw subtle jabs, trying to provoke a reaction, but Emily never took the bait. She was always one step ahead, always holding her ground with that quiet, unshakable strength. One evening, after yet another failed attempt to rattle her, Ethan found himself pacing the length of his office, his hands clenched into fists. He couldn't understand it. Why wasn't she affected by him? Why wasn't she crumbling under the weight of their marriage, the way he had expected? Emily was supposed to be the weak one. She was supposed to be grateful for the life he had given her. But instead, it was Ethan who was starting to feel trapped, powerless in the face of her calm defiance. He hated it, but more than that, he was starting to hate the fact that a small part of him respected her for it. Will Ethan manage to break through Emily's composure? Or is he the one who's truly losing control of the game they're both playing? If you are liking the story, don't forget to subscribe to help us continue bringing stories every day. Ethan Collins had always believed he knew the game. He had spent years mastering the art of manipulation and control, learning from his father, Richard Collins, a man who built his empire on ruthlessness. Ethan's world was simple, power was absolute, and the ones who held it dictated the rules. He had lived his life with that principle, never doubting that he would always stay on top. But ever since his marriage to Emily Carter, the ground beneath him had begun to shift, little by little, until he no longer felt the solid footing of control. Emily, his wife of 3 months, remained an enigma he couldn't unravel. Despite his best efforts to provoke her, to intimidate her, to gain any sort of upper hand, she never wavered. She met his cruelty with calm, his arrogance with indifference. And that, more than anything, drove Ethan to the edge. He had been so sure this marriage would be nothing more than a business arrangement, a necessary evil to secure his inheritance. Yet, each passing day brought more tension, more frustration. It wasn't just that she didn't react the way he expected. It was that she seemed to know something he didn't. There was a calmness about her, a quiet confidence that suggested she had secrets of her own. For weeks, Ethan had pushed and prodded, but she remained impenetrable. And now the balance of power was slowly, but surely shifting out of his hands. That realization terrified him. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, Ethan found himself in his father's study, pacing. The room was dark, the only light coming from the small lamp on the desk, casting long shadows across the rows of old books lining the walls. This study had always felt suffocating to him, filled with the ghosts of his father's expectations. Richard Collins had been a man of few words, but his presence had loomed large over Ethan's life. Now, in the quiet of the house, with Emily somewhere down the hall, Ethan felt the weight of his father's influence more than ever. He sat down heavily in the leather chair behind the desk, staring at the glass of whiskey in his hand. The familiar burn of the liquor did nothing to calm his nerves. What had his father been thinking, forcing him into this marriage? Was it some kind of twisted lesson, a test of Ethan's ability to maintain control in even the most uncomfortable circumstances? He had never doubted that his father's every action had a purpose, but the reasoning behind this particular move still eluded him. Ethan was about to take another sip when something on the desk caught his eye. It was an old photograph, half hidden beneath a stack of papers. He pulled it out, frowning as he studied the image. It was a picture of his father, smiling, something Richard Collins rarely did. Next to him stood another man, one Ethan vaguely recognized as Henry Carter, Emily's father. The two men were standing in front of a large construction site, hard hats on, their expressions proud. Behind them was the outline of what would eventually become one of the most successful developments in the city, a project that had cemented Richard Collins' reputation as a real estate titan. Ethan stared at the photograph, his mind racing. He had seen this picture before years ago, but he had never thought much of it. His father and Henry had been business partners once, but their relationship had ended badly. That much he knew. What he didn't know were the details, the why. And now, looking at the photograph, Ethan felt a nagging sense that there was something here, something he had missed. He set the picture down and opened the desk drawer, searching for anything that might offer answers. As he rummaged through old contracts and letters, his hand brushed against something hard. Pulling it out, he found a worn, leather-bound journal. His father's journal. Ethan hadn't even known it existed. His heart pounded as he flipped it open, scanning the pages filled with Richard Collins' neat, precise handwriting. Most of it was business-related notes about deals, projects, meetings. But then, near the middle of the journal, Ethan found something that made his blood run cold. June 14th. I've made a decision today that will change everything. The Carter deal has gone south, far worse than I anticipated. Henry's investments were more unstable than I realized, and now, the entire project is on the verge of collapse. If I pull out now, I can save Collins Enterprises, but it will destroy Henry. I've tried to reason with him, tried to explain the risks, but he won't listen. He's too proud, too stubborn. It's not just business anymore. It's personal. But I have no choice. I have to protect my legacy. Henry won't survive this. Ethan's hands shook as he read the words. His father had knowingly destroyed Henry Carter. It wasn't an accident, wasn't a miscalculation. It had been a deliberate choice, one that had ruined the Carter family and, by extension, Emily's life. Ethan felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. All this time, he had believed his father's greatness was built on brilliance and strategy. But this was betrayal, cold, calculated betrayal. And now he understood. Emily wasn't just some pawn in this game. She wasn't here because she needed his money or because she had nowhere else to go. She was here because this was her chance to face the son of the man who had destroyed her family. To face him. The realization hit Ethan like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. This wasn't just a marriage. This was revenge. Ethan didn't sleep that night. The revelation that his father had been responsible for the Carters' downfall, and by extension Emily's misery, left him reeling. Every interaction with her over the past 3 months replayed in his mind, each one taking on a new meaning. The coldness in her eyes, the calm defiance, the way she had never flinched under his attempts to belittle her. She had known all along. She had married him, not out of obligation, but out of some deep-seated need to reclaim what had been taken from her. And the worst part was that Ethan had played right into her hands. The next morning, he confronted her. He found her in the garden, sitting on a stone bench beneath one of the tall oak trees that lined the property. The morning sun filtered through the branches, casting dappled shadows across the ground. Emily looked serene, as if she had all the time in the world. But when she saw Ethan approaching, something flickered in her eyes. something guarded. Ethan stopped a few feet away, his chest tight, his mind still spinning from the revelations of the night before. For a moment he just looked at her, unsure of where to begin. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, but when he spoke, his voice was surprisingly calm. "How long have you known?" Emily didn't flinch. She met his gaze evenly, her expression unreadable. "Known what? Don't play games with me, Emily," Ethan snapped, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "How long have you known that my father was the one who destroyed your family?" For a split second, something flashed in her eyes, pain, anger, but it was gone just as quickly as it had appeared. She looked away, her gaze shifting to the garden around them. "I've always known," she said quietly, her voice steady. "I knew the moment my father lost everything. I knew it was because of your father's decisions." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "And that's why you agreed to this marriage, isn't it? To get close enough to, what, ruin me? Take revenge?" Emily let out a soft, bitter laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You think too highly of yourself, Ethan. This was never about you." Her words hit him harder than he expected. She stood up then, brushing invisible dust from her dress, before turning to face him fully. "This marriage was a way for me to take back control of my life," she said, her voice calm but laced with something raw. "Your father took everything from my family, our home, our security, our future. We went from having everything to nothing in a matter of months. I watched my father fall apart. I watched my mother lose hope, and I swore I would never let anyone have that kind of power over me again." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to argue, to deny it, but he couldn't. Everything she was saying was true. His father had taken everything from her, and now, here she was, strong, composed, and standing before him, unbroken. Emily took a step closer, her eyes locking onto his. "I didn't marry you to ruin you, Ethan. I married you because this was the only way to take back what was mine. I wanted my family's name to mean something again, and I was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen." Ethan stared at her, his mind racing. This was not the woman he had thought she was. She was stronger than he had ever imagined, driven by a sense of justice and revenge that he couldn't even begin to comprehend. And now, standing before her, he realized that he wasn't the one in control. He never had been. The silence between them stretched, thick with tension and unspoken truths. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but Emily cut him off. "I don't expect you to understand," she said softly, her gaze softening just a little. "You've never had to fight for anything in your life. Everything was handed to you. But for me, this marriage was a way to survive. And now, I'm going to make sure my family's legacy is remembered, whether you're part of that or not." Her words hung in the air, heavy and final. For the first time in his life, Ethan Collins felt truly powerless. He had spent years building his empire, following in his father's footsteps, believing that control was the only thing that mattered. But now, standing before the woman who had been his wife for 3 months, he realized that control was an illusion. Emily had never needed him. She had never wanted him. And now, he wasn't sure if he had the strength to face the consequences of the choices his father, and by extension, he had made. That night, Ethan sat in the darkened study, the journal still open on the desk in front of him. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, guilt, confusion. He had always believed that power was about control, about bending people to his will. But Emily had shown him that true power came from something deeper, something he had never understood. As he stared at the pages filled with his father's meticulous handwriting, one thought consumed him. Was it too late to make things right? With his world turned upside down, can Ethan find a way to make amends? Or will his father's sins destroy everything he thought he knew? If you are liking the story, don't forget to subscribe to help us continue bringing stories every day. The days after Emily's revelation were some of the darkest of Ethan's life. He found himself lost in the maze of his own mind, the weight of his father's sins pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. He had always prided himself on being in control, of himself, of his surroundings, of his future. But now, For the first time, that control was gone, slipping through his fingers like sand. Everywhere Ethan turned, he was reminded of what he had done, or rather, what his father had done in his name. The mansion, once a symbol of power and prestige, now felt like a prison. The wealth and status he had inherited seemed tainted, poisoned by the realization that it had all come at the expense of others, people like Emily's family. He spent hours in his father's study, reading through the journal, trying to make sense of how things had gone so wrong. Each entry was like a knife twisting in his gut, a painful reminder that his father had not been the infallible titan he'd always imagined, but a man willing to sacrifice others for his own gain. Worse still, Ethan had followed in those same footsteps, walking blindly into a life that wasn't entirely his own. Emily's words echoed in his mind constantly. You've never had to fight for anything in your life. Everything was handed to you. He hated how right she was. It wasn't that Ethan hadn't worked hard. He had. But he had never truly faced hardship. He had never known what it was to lose everything. Emily had. And now, despite all his efforts to dominate their relationship, she was the one with the strength, the one who had survived. For the first time, Ethan felt small, vulnerable. It was a cold, gray afternoon when Ethan finally left the study and went looking for Emily. He found her in the garden, sitting on the same stone bench where they had argued days before. The wind was biting, rustling the bare branches of the trees, but she didn't seem to mind. She looked calm, serene, as though the storm inside her had finally settled. Ethan, on the other hand, was a mess. He stood there for a moment watching her, unsure of how to begin. His mind raced with all the things he wanted to say, but none of them felt right. He had always been so sure of himself, always known exactly what to say to get what he wanted. But this was different. He wasn't sure what he wanted anymore. After a long silence, Emily looked up at him. Her green eyes were unreadable, guarded, as they always were. What is it, Ethan? Her voice was calm, but there was a hardness beneath the surface, a wall he knew he couldn't break through with his usual charm or wit. He had tried that before and it had failed, miserably. Ethan swallowed hard, taking a step closer. I need to talk to you, he said, his voice quieter than he intended. About everything. Emily didn't move, didn't invite him to sit beside her. She just watched him, waiting. He took a deep breath, shoving his hands into his pockets as he looked out at the garden. I didn't know, he started, his words stumbling over themselves. About my father, about what he did to your family. I didn't know any of it. For a moment, Emily said nothing. Then, quietly, she responded, but you benefited from it. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been expecting anger, maybe even a fight, but this cold truth cut deeper than anything else she could have said. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. I did. He felt her eyes on him, and for a brief second, he wished she would yell at him, scream, anything to release the tension that hung between them. But she didn't. Instead, she just waited, as though she already knew what he was going to say next. I don't know how to fix this, Ethan admitted, his voice breaking just a little. I don't know how to make things right. Emily finally looked away, her gaze drifting to the barren garden around them. You can't fix the past, Ethan. The words hung in the cold air, heavy and unmovable. Ethan's chest tightened. He knew she was right. Nothing he could do would change what had happened. His father's decisions had destroyed her family, and he had been complicit in that, whether he had known it or not. But he couldn't just walk away. Not now. I want to try, he said, his voice firming with conviction. I want to make up for what's been done. I don't know how yet, but I want to find a way. Emily looked at him again, this time with a trace of something softer in her eyes, though it was still guarded. Why? She asked, her tone low but demanding. Why do you care now? Ethan hesitated, unsure of how to explain the shift inside him. The truth was, he wasn't even sure when it had started. Maybe it had been that first day she arrived, standing tall and composed despite everything. Maybe it had been the way she refused to bend to his will, defying his attempts to dominate her. Or maybe it had been the moment he realized how deeply he was implicated in his father's legacy. and how little he had ever questioned the cost of his success. "I care because I see things differently now," he said finally, his voice filled with a quiet, vulnerable honesty that surprised even him. "I see you differently." Emily's expression didn't change, but she didn't look away. She was listening. "I've been so focused on holding on to power, on proving that I could be just as strong and ruthless as my father," Ethan continued, his words flowing more easily now. "But I didn't realize that strength isn't just about controlling everything around you. It's about owning your mistakes, facing the consequences of them. And I've made mistakes, Emily. I see that now." There was a long silence. The wind whispered through the trees, and for a moment, Ethan thought she might just walk away, leave him standing there in his vulnerability. But then, to his surprise, she spoke. "You think it's that easy?" Emily's voice was quiet but sharp. "You think realizing you've made mistakes changes anything?" Ethan shook his head, the weight of her words heavy in his chest. "No, I know it doesn't, but it's a start." The days that followed were filled with tension, but something had shifted between Ethan and Emily. He had stopped trying to control her, stopped trying to win whatever twisted game he had thought they were playing. Instead, he focused on listening, on understanding. It wasn't easy. Every instinct he had told him to fight, to push back, to assert dominance. But for once, he didn't. He began to see things differently, his father, his business, his entire life. He had always believed that wealth and power were the ultimate goals, that success was measured in dollars and deals. But now he saw the cracks in that facade. He saw how much had been lost in the pursuit of that success. Relationships, trust, humanity. Ethan threw himself into work, but not the kind he was used to. Instead of focusing on the massive deals that had once consumed his time, he turned his attention to smaller, more personal endeavors. He began meeting with small business owners who had been affected by his father's ruthless business practices, offering them financial help and guidance. He didn't do it for recognition or praise. He did it because it felt right. One afternoon, he sat across from an older man, the owner of a small restaurant that had been on the verge of bankruptcy. Ethan had offered him a loan with favorable terms, something that would help him get back on his feet without crippling debt. As the man thanked him, tears in his eyes, Ethan felt something shift inside him, a sense of purpose that went beyond the superficial. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt like he was making a difference, not just for himself but for others. But even as he threw himself into this new way of living, there was still a part of him that doubted whether it was enough. Could he really make up for the damage his family had done? Could he ever truly make things right with Emily? Emily watched his efforts with a quiet, cautious eye. She didn't praise him, didn't offer words of encouragement. She had seen too many false promises, too many hollow apologies in her life to believe that change could happen so easily. But there was something different about Ethan now, something that intrigued her, though she wouldn't admit it. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Ethan spoke up. "I've been meeting with some of the people who were affected by my father's business. I'm trying to help them, give them some of the opportunities that were taken from them." Emily didn't respond right away. She sipped her tea, her gaze thoughtful. "Why?" Ethan's brow furrowed. "What do you mean, why? Why are you doing this, Ethan?" Emily's voice was steady, but there was a sharpness to it, a challenge. "Is this about redemption? About making yourself feel better?" Ethan paused, considering her words. He had asked himself the same question. Was he doing this to ease his guilt, to prove to himself that he wasn't his father? Or was it something deeper? "I don't know," he admitted after a long pause. "Maybe it's both. Maybe I just want to prove that I can be better than what I was." Emily set her cup down on the table, her eyes locking onto his. "Redemption isn't about proving anything. It's about facing the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it is. It's about accepting that some things can't be fixed." Her words hit him like a cold splash of water. Ethan had always believed that if he worked hard enough, if he just did enough, he could fix anything. But now, sitting across from Emily, he realized that some scars ran too deep. "So what do I do?" he asked quietly, his voice raw with uncertainty. Emily studied him for a long moment before she spoke. "You live with it. You learn from it. and you stop trying to control everything. For the first time in his life, Ethan was learning to let go. It wasn't easy. Control had always been his safety net, his way of navigating the world. But now, with Emily's guidance, silent though it often was, he was beginning to see that control was an illusion, a mask he had worn for far too long. He didn't know if he could ever truly make things right with Emily, or with the people whose lives his father had destroyed. But for the first time, Ethan wasn't focused on the end result. He was focused on the journey, on the small steps that would take him closer to being the man he wanted to be. It was a long road, and he wasn't sure where it would lead. But for the first time, he was willing to walk it. Can Ethan truly transform, or will his past continue to haunt him, threatening to undo all the progress he's made? If you are liking the story, don't forget to subscribe to help us continue bringing stories every day. Ethan Collins stood at the edge of the garden, staring at the horizon as the late afternoon sun dipped below the skyline. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of freshly turned earth and the faint sweetness of spring blooms. It was a quiet, peaceful moment, but inside, Ethan's mind was anything but calm. It had been 6 months since his world had unraveled, since Emily had revealed the truth about his father's betrayal and the devastation that followed. In those months, Ethan had begun the painful process of rebuilding, not his wealth or his power, but himself. The journey had been slow and difficult, filled with moments of doubt, anger, and guilt. But in the stillness of this late afternoon, he realized that something inside him had fundamentally shifted. He was no longer the man he had been when this all began. His thoughts drifted to Emily. She was the reason for this change, whether she realized it or not. Her strength, her resilience, her refusal to let him off the hook had forced him to confront the darkest parts of himself. She had made him face the truth, even when it hurt, and now, after months of trying to prove to her, and to himself, that he could be better, he was ready for whatever came next. Inside the mansion, Emily stood by the window watching Ethan from a distance. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he seemed lost in thought. Over the past few months, she had watched him change. First, she hadn't believed it was real. She had seen too many empty promises, too many men trying to absolve themselves of guilt through grand gestures. But Ethan had been different. Slowly, steadily, he had proven that his change wasn't just for show. He had worked tirelessly, not for recognition, but because he genuinely wanted to make amends. She had seen it in the way he treated the small business owners he helped, in the way he listened to people's stories instead of talking over them, and in the quiet humility that had replaced his once overbearing arrogance. It was subtle, but it was real. And yet, despite everything, Emily still wasn't sure what their future held. She had come into this marriage with her own agenda, driven by a need for justice and a desire to reclaim her family's honor. But now, as she watched Ethan from the window, she wondered if there could be more between them. Could she ever truly forgive him, not just for what his father had done, but for the way he had tried to control her in the beginning? Could she trust him, knowing how deeply rooted his need for power had once been? These questions lingered in her mind as she turned away from the window and headed toward the garden. It was time to talk, truly talk. Ethan heard her footsteps before he saw her. He turned, his eyes meeting hers as she approached. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, the weight of their shared past hanging in the silence. Finally, it was Emily who broke the quiet. "You've changed," she said simply, her voice soft but steady. Ethan looked down at the ground, his hands in his pockets. "I've tried," he replied, the humility in his voice a stark contrast to the man he had once been. "I don't know if it's enough, but I've tried." Emily nodded, folding her arms as she considered his words. "It's not about trying, Ethan. It's about what happens next. You've done a lot of good, but that doesn't erase what's been done. It doesn't fix everything." "I know," Ethan said, his voice quiet, "and I'm not asking for it to. I want to be better, not just for you or for the people my father hurt, but for myself. I spent so many years chasing after power, trying to live up to his legacy. But now I see that it wasn't worth it. I don't want to be that man anymore, Emily studied him, her green eyes searching his face for any sign of dishonesty or manipulation. But there was none. He was being honest, raw in a way she hadn't seen before. Slowly, she exhaled, letting the tension in her shoulders ease just a little. "You've come a long way," she admitted. "I didn't think you had it in you, but you've surprised me." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "So what now?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Emily looked down at the ground for a moment, gathering her thoughts. When she looked back up, her expression was softer, but still serious. "I don't know," she said honestly. "What happened between our families, what your father did. It left scars, Ethan. Scars that don't just go away." Ethan nodded, his chest tightening. He had expected this. "I understand, but," she continued, her voice softer now, "I've also seen the man you're trying to become. And I think, maybe, there's a chance for something different between us." Ethan's heart skipped a beat, hope flickering in his chest. "Something different?" he asked carefully. Emily gave a small, tentative smile. "I don't know what that looks like yet, but I think we owe it to ourselves to find out. If we can rebuild something real." Ethan's throat tightened with emotion. He had spent so many months wondering if he could ever earn her trust, her forgiveness. And now, here she was, offering him the possibility of something he had never dared hope for: redemption, not just for his past, but for their future. "I'd like that," he said softly, his voice thick with sincerity. "I'd like that a lot." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their journey pressing down on them. But this time, the silence was different. It wasn't filled with tension or unspoken resentment. It was filled with possibility. Later that evening, they sat together in the living room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. The air was warm, comfortable, and for the first time in months, Ethan felt a sense of peace. He wasn't sure where things would go from here, whether they could truly rebuild what had been broken, whether they could ever fully trust each other. But he was willing to try, and for the first time he felt like Emily was willing to meet him halfway. As they sat in the quiet, Ethan reached out and took her hand. She didn't pull away. "I know I can't fix everything," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make things right." Emily didn't say anything at first. She simply squeezed his hand, her touch warm and steady. After a long moment, she spoke. "We'll see," she said quietly, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "We'll see. Has Ethan truly redeemed himself? Or is this just the beginning of a new chapter in their story? One filled with the hard work of trust, forgiveness, and rebuilding? If Ethan and Emily's story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let us know. Do you think Ethan has truly changed? Or is there still more to prove? Your insights are what make this community special. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay connected with us. We've got more powerful stories coming your way, just like this one, and we don't want you to miss out. Before you go, check out the next story that's waiting for you on screen now. It's filled with twists you won't see coming. Enjoy!